The Servants of Satan, written by Seabury Quinn, read for you by Edward E. French. Part 1. The Salem Horror. When the sightseeing bus from Boston carries tourists from the west and south through the crooked and historic streets of Salem, Massachusetts, the lecturer waves his megaphone toward a long, turtleback rise of land with the stereotyped announcement, "On your left, ladies and gentlemen, is the famous Gallows Hill, where witches were hanged in the colonial days." Just that. A 19-word sentence, a craning of curious necks, a raising of perfunctorily interested eyes, and the cumbersome omnibus rumbles and bumps away on its homeward trip, leaving behind the monument of the most dreadful chapter in American history. A spot accursed to this day by the blood of innocent victims of fanaticism. A landmark bearing testimony to the terrible conflagration kindled by the effort of a bigoted, ignorant, self-righteous man to reassert his sway over the community and retain the pitiful salary of a parson in a small and none too thriving colonial church. Let us push back the hands of the clock 3 centuries. Salem Village, small, but even now prosperous, clings to the rocky promontory jutting Europeward into the Atlantic Ocean. A few substantial houses of clapboard, fewer mansions of brick, brought as ballast in ships from England, and a 4-square, white-doored church. 4 men, heavily cloaked against the shrewish October wind, stride determinedly through the narrow, unpaved street, talking earnestly. They are Joseph Parker, Joseph Hutchinson, Joseph Putnam, and Daniel Andrews, all freeholders in Salem Village, appointed at a recent town meeting to consider ways and means for adjusting the controversy raging between the Reverend Samuel Parris, pastor of Salem Village Church, and his congregation. 2 years before, the Reverend Mr. Parris was called to the pulpit of Salem Village Church in an effort to heal the dissension cleaving the congregation. In settling in his position, the reverend gentleman drove a hard bargain with his people, extracting in pay the last brass farthing the congregation could raise. Since his installation, he has intrigued continually for greater power in the community. Failing to secure a deed to the parsonage property in his own name, he has set one faction of the congregation against another, taking sides first with one side, then the other, till the little band of worshippers is torn to pieces with factional strife. From the window of his study in the manse, Mr. Parris sees the 4 selectmen striding down the street, and his sallow face reflects the misgivings his heart feels. These men, substantial citizens all, are not to be browbeaten or bullied by any clergyman, no matter how thunderous his words or violent his temper. They will surely suggest the emptying of his pulpit as the only means of settling the controversy. Something must be done. A means must be found to unite the people in one common cause and divert their dislike from their pastor. Love? No. The Reverend Mr. Parris's religion knows no love. He is a fundamentalist of the fundamentalists and, like his modern brethren of the same school, finds his favorite passages of Scripture among those which tell of the dreadful vengeance of the Almighty. Fear? Hatred? Perhaps. Those emotions sway men and women more vigorously than anything else. But how? How? The reverend gentleman takes up his great cedar-bound Bible and opens it at random. Advice, if not comfort, is to be found in its pages. He reads intently by the waning afternoon sunshine, his long, crooked-nailed forefinger tracing the words as his eyes devour line after line. The 27th verse of the 20th chapter of the book of Leviticus. "And a man also or a woman that hath a familiar spirit, or that is a wizard, shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them." Mr. Parris closes the holy book and paces his study floor, his head bent, his lean, knotty fingers locked behind his back. He meditates the text he has just read. "Their blood shall be upon them." Among other household effects, the Reverend Mr. Parris owned 2 servants, John Indian, a partially civilized American aborigine, and Tituba, a half-breed woman from the West Indies, part Indian, part Negro. Like most West Indian slaves, this woman laid claim to a knowledge of voodooism or obeah, pretending to tell fortunes by palmistry and foretell the future by divination and communion with the spirits of the dead. Such things were roundly denounced and heavily penalized by the laws of the colony, which makes what followed doubly hard to explain. During the winter of 1691-2, a circle of young girls and women began meeting at the Reverend Mr. Parris's home for the purpose of consulting Tituba and learning the secrets of palmistry and fortune-telling. Those engaged in the forbidden pastime were Elizabeth Parris, age 9, Abigail Williams, 17, Ann Putnam, 12, Mary Walcott, 17, Elizabeth Hubbard, 17, Susanna Sheldon, 18, Elizabeth Booth, 18, Sarah Churchill, 20, and several others in their late teens or early 20s. Mr. Parris could not have been unaware of these gatherings or of their purpose, for 2 of the young women, Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams, were members of his immediate family, and all the seances were held in his kitchen. Nevertheless, it does not appear that he forbade Tituba to teach the black arts to members of his family and flock, or denounced the unlawful assemblies to the authorities. On the contrary, he seems to have expressed a mildness and tolerance entirely at variance with his usual habit and the custom of the times and community. Winter ran its course, and springtime came, and with it a remarkable sequel to the meetings at Mr. Parris's house. The girls and women who had studied with Tituba began behaving in a most unaccountable manner. Some of them would creep under chairs, tables, or benches. Others uttered strange and unintelligible words and cries. Still others indulged in spasms and fainting fits, choosing the most public places to display their seizures, simple home remedies failing to relieve the children's strange illness. The village physician, a Dr. Griggs, was called in, and after making an exhaustive examination of the patients, gave it as his opinion that they were bewitched. This was quite in accordance with the medical ethics of the times, which permitted physicians to make the devil the excuse for their own inability to diagnose a case or effect a cure. The devil was no laughingstock in the 17th century. He was a very real and personal fiend, devoutly believed in by all who called themselves Christians, and was ever on the watch for some unwary soul. All the world was a sector on which the forces of good and evil contended unremittingly, and, just as God chose his ministers, so the devil chose to further his work among men. Holy Scripture declared that there were such things as witches, and it was man's bounden duty as a good follower of the Church to kill off the wicked brood wherever found. So it was in Salem village in 1692, and the doctor's announcement of witchcraft set the superstitious people afire. The afflicted children, differing not at all from children today, proceeded to make the most of their position in the public eye, and acted more outlandishly than before. Abigail Williams, Mr. Parris's own niece, rose in church one Sunday morning and shouted to her uncle, "Now stand up and name thy text." All eyes were turned on her in horrified amazement. But Mr. Parris, who had never before been known to let a slight to his ministerial dignity go unrebuked, looked mildly at her and announced that his sermon would be based on the 18th verse of the 22nd chapter of the book of Exodus. "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Sermons in those days were not gauged by the minute hand of the preacher's watch, but by the sands of an hourglass on the pulpit rail, and it was not till the glass had been twice reversed that Mr. Parris concluded his impassioned harangue. He traced the abominable crime of witchcraft from biblical days to the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, ever reverting to his text and urging the congregation to perform their religious duty and put all witches to death. At the conclusion of his discourse, the little church was filled with an hysterical mob, ready to turn upon any suspected person and execute him on the spot. And the excitement was raised to fever pitch when one of the bewitched girls suddenly rose to her feet and cried, "Look where she sits upon the beam!" "Who? Who?" asked the congregation excitedly, for they of course saw no one seated on the ceiling beams. Another girl, also eager to be noticed, rose with a wild shriek and exclaimed, "There is a yellow bird sitting on the minister's hat!" "Where? Where?" the bewildered people cried, for the yellow bird was naturally as invisible to them as the witch on the crossbeams. When the meeting was over, the children's parents pressed them to name the wicked persons who had bewitched them, but here the girls became vague, contenting themselves with rolling their eyes, uttering terrified cries, and pointing distractedly at terrible sights visible only to themselves. The afflicted children were hurried to the parsonage, where their parents besought Mr. Parris to pray for them. Dismissing the elders, the minister locked himself in his study with the bewitched persons. At the end of an hour, he opened the door and announced the children had accused Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne as the witches who had cast the spell upon them. Sarah Good was a poor, friendless old woman, subsisting largely on the charity of her neighbors. Sarah Osborne was nearing 80 years of age and had been confined to bed by a lingering illness for several weeks. Both of these hapless creatures were dragged to the church, where a tribunal of clergymen, hastily summoned by Mr. Parris, bullied and hectored them for hours on end. No third degree imposed by modern police ever approached the methods employed by these godly men in attempting to extort confessions from two distracted and friendless old women. But the prisoners stood firm in maintaining their innocence. Then it was that Mr. Parris took counsel with the bewitched girls again, exhorting them to name some other witch responsible for their agony. Soon he returned with the scandalous intelligence that Tituba, his own slave, had been denounced by the afflicted children. Tituba was haled before the meeting, but her terror was so great that no intelligent answers could be extracted from her. She was paroled in the custody of her master, who promised his reverend colleagues he would reason with her and impress her with the error of her ways. Years later, when she had been sold to another master, Tituba, then an old woman, told of terrible beatings administered by her reverend owner, beatings merciless and unceasing, until she willingly agreed to confess herself a witch and implicate Goody Osborne and Goody Good in her confession. Before a court composed of John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, the two leading magistrates of the neighborhood, assisted by Mr. Parris and several other eminent divines, Tituba gave her testimony. The devil, she said, had appeared to her and asked her to serve him. She agreed to do his bidding and was told to attend a witches' meeting in a nearby wood. Together with Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, she had mounted a wagon pole and been whisked through the air with the speed of the wind. In the heart of a deep, dark grove, the location of which she was unable to give, the devil awaited them in the form of a huge black man with one eye in the center of his forehead. She and the other two women had signed their names in his book with a pen dipped in their own blood, kissed him on an unusual part of his anatomy, and acknowledged themselves his servants forevermore. All this time the afflicted children had been keeping up an incessant noise, screaming, groaning, and writhing on the floor. When Goody Osborne's poor old hands twitched with nervousness, the children declared they suffered agonies, for she was pinching them. When Sarah Good brought her toothless gums together in senile terror, the shameless little wretches shrieked out that they were being bitten. Poor, bedridden Sarah Osborne showed conclusively that she could not have attended any such meeting as that described by Tituba, for she had been confined to her home with illness at the time she was supposed to be attending the assignation. That, the court decided, was all the more proof of her witchcraft. Only a witch could be in two places at once, and since Tituba had testified Sarah Osborne was present at the meeting with the devil, and Sarah Osborne had shown she was home in bed at that very time, why, forsooth, She was in both spots at the same moment, and therefore more undoubtedly a witch than ever. Tituba, Sarah Osborne, and Sarah Good were sent to Ipswich jail as convicted witches, there to lie awaiting the hangman's convenience. Exposure and the weight of the heavy iron fetters riveted on her wrists and ankles proved too much for Mrs. Osborne. She died in jail. Tituba, because she had confessed, and especially because she had made the other two women's conviction possible, was granted a pardon and sent to Boston to be sold as a slave, where it was supposed she would fall into the hands of an owner who would take her and her power for working evil far away from Salem village. Perhaps the fact that her removal would prevent her babblings from connecting the Reverend Mr. Parris with the inception of the witchcraft prosecutions might have had some weight. Sarah Good lived to mount the gallows. As she stood with the rope about her throat, a clergyman said, "Thou art a wicked witch." "You are a liar," replied the old woman with spirit. "I am no more a witch than you are, and if you take my life, God will give you blood to drink." The end of Servants of Satan, Part 1. The Salem Horror. Written by Seabury Quinn, told to you by Edward E. French. The second of Seabury Quinn's true tales of witchcraft will describe the accusations of evil made by our Puritan ancestors against Giles and Martha Corey, whose memory has been preserved in Longfellow's poem dramas. The spectacular death of the stubborn wizard, Giles Corey, beneath a beam, and the hanging of his wife Martha on Gallows Hill, belong to the darkest period of America's history.